Before I tell you what my son said that day, I need you to understand something about silence, because silence isn't always empty, sometimes it's full. So full that it presses against your chest until you feel like you might laugh or cry or sigh all at once. Ha 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 sigh, and that morning started like any other, soft light coming through the curtains, dust floating like tiny memories in the air, and I remember standing by the window thinking about how strange life is. How one day you're tying a child's shoes and the next day you're asking yourself when their voice started sounding like a stranger's, and I wasn't expecting anything dramatic that day, no warnings, no bad dreams. Just the usual ache in my knees and that familiar quiet that comes when the house has heard too many years, too many footsteps, too many arguments and apologies soaked into its walls. I even smiled a little, thinking about how I used to rush through mornings, packing lunches, smoothing hair, reminding him not to forget his jacket, and isn't it funny how the smallest habits become the heaviest memories later? Because they're the ones that prove you were there, really there, even when no one remembers it out loud anymore. And as I stood there, I felt this odd calm, not happiness, not sadness either. Just that still place you reach when you've cried enough times that tears start coming slower, like your heart learned to ration them, and maybe that's why what happened later didn't knock me over the way people think it would have. Because part of me, a quiet part I didn't even know existed until then, had already accepted that something between us had been breaking for a long time, crack by crack, smile by smile. Until one day you realize you're holding two pieces instead of one whole. Sigh. You see, my son and I, we didn't fight loudly. There were no slammed doors or screaming matches you could point to and say, that's where it all went wrong. No. Ours was softer, slower, the kind of distance that grows when conversations turn shorter and visits turn into obligations, when you start noticing how he checks his phone more than your face, how he answers with yeah instead of stories. And you tell yourself it's normal, kids grow up, they get busy, life pulls them away. Ha ha ha, that's what you tell yourself at night when the house creaks, and you pretend it's just the wood settling and not the sound of being left behind. And I remember telling myself I shouldn't expect too much. Expectations are dangerous, they bruise easily, but deep down, in that stubborn place where mothers keep their hope, I still believed that no matter how far he drifted, there were lines he wouldn't cross, invisible lines drawn by blood and history, and the fact that I carried him inside me once, that surely meant something, didn't it? I guess that's the thing about lines. You only realize they're gone after someone steps right over them and keeps walking, and when the day finally brought us together, it wasn't even dramatic at first, just a gathering, relatives scattered around like familiar furniture. Everyone pretending to listen while really listening for something else, that unspoken tension that floats in rooms where families gather but honesty doesn't. And I remember noticing small things, the way voices dipped when I walked past, the way eyes slid away too quickly, and I thought, maybe I'm imagining it, maybe this is just what getting older feels like, becoming invisible in a room you once ruled with snacks and schedules and hugs. Ha ha ha, but then there was that moment, the one that stretches in your memory like it lasted an hour even though it was probably just a few seconds, when my son looked at me, not with anger, not even with annoyance, but with something colder, something rehearsed like he'd practiced the tone in his head, and before the words even came, I felt my stomach drop, that heavy, sinking feeling, as if my body knew what my mind hadn't caught up to yet. And I remember thinking, don't react too fast, don't say anything yet, just listen, because sometimes the way someone says something tells you more than the words themselves. And as he opened his mouth, I realized how strange it was that I could still see the boy he used to be in the shape of his face, in the way his eyebrows moved, and yet feel so completely shut out at the same time. Sigh, it's a strange kind of grief. Mourning someone who's still standing right in front of you, and I wish I could tell you that in that moment I felt anger first, or heartbreak, or the urge to defend myself. But honestly, what I felt was clarity, sharp and quiet. Like a window being wiped clean after years of fog, because suddenly all those little moments lined up, all those swallowed comments and polite nods and its fine answers, they finally made sense, and I knew, before he even finished speaking, that whatever he was about to say wasn't really about that day, or that room, or even that event. It was about power, about control, about who he thought I was now, and who he thought he had become. Ha ha ha, and maybe that's why I didn't interrupt, didn't gasp or protest or remind him of everything I'd done, because once you see the truth that clearly there's no point in arguing with it, you just let it stand there in the light. And I let him speak every word while the room seemed to hold its breath, and somewhere deep inside me, beneath the ache and the memories and the quiet sadness, something else stirred, something steady, something patient, and as he finished, I realized this wasn't the end of my story at all, it was just the moment everyone else thought they understood it. And if you've ever been looked at like you no longer belong in a life you helped build, then you already know why what happened next mattered so much, because silence can be a pause or it can be preparation, and mine had been a long time coming. When he said it, it didn't land like a slap. It landed like cold air, sudden and sharp, stealing the breath without making a sound, and the strange thing is I remember noticing everything except my own face. The way one aunt stopped mid-sip with her cup hovering near her lips, the way a cousin's fingers tightened around a phone they forgot to scroll, the way someone cleared their throat and immediately regretted the noise. Ha ha ha, sigh. It was one of those moments where the room doesn't explode, it freezes, and his words hung there heavy and awkward like furniture no one wanted to claim. "You're not coming to the funeral," he said, calm, almost polite. As if he were canceling a dinner plan instead of cutting a line that should never have been touched, and for a heartbeat, maybe two, I honestly wondered if I'd misheard him. Because sometimes your mind tries to protect you by pretending reality tripped over its own words, and I waited for someone to laugh nervously to correct him, to say, "He didn't mean it like that," but no one did. No one spoke at all, and that silence was louder than shouting. It pressed against my ears until I could hear my own breathing, slow and careful, as if my body instinctively knew this was not the moment to rush. And I felt every pair of eyes on me without seeing a single one directly, that uncomfortable stare people give when they don't want to choose sides, when they're relieved it's not happening to them, and I could almost hear their thoughts spinning, wondering how a mother should respond to something like that, whether I would cry, argue, beg, or finally snap, and maybe that's what made it feel so unreal, because I knew they were watching for a reaction, not for understanding. And there's a difference between the two. Ha, reactions entertain, understanding makes people uncomfortable, and my son, he stood there waiting too, not nervously, not angrily, just expectant. Like he'd already decided how this would go and was simply waiting for me to play my part, the emotional part, the messy part, the one that would make his decision look justified, and something inside me tightened at that realization. Not in pain, but in awareness, because suddenly I could see the shape of the moment clearly, like stepping back from a painting and finally seeing the whole picture instead of just the brushstrokes. And I thought, so this is how it is now. This is how you speak to me, in front of everyone, without lowering your voice, without softening the edge, and I felt a familiar ache rise up, that old instinct to explain myself, to remind him of late nights and scraped knees and birthdays held together with borrowed money and love. So much love, sigh, but I didn't let it out. I swallowed it, not because it wasn't true, but because I suddenly understood it wouldn't matter here. This wasn't a conversation, it was a declaration, and declarations aren't meant to be discussed, they're meant to be endured or defied. And as I stood there, I became painfully aware of how small movements suddenly felt enormous, how even shifting my weight seemed like it might break something, and I wondered if this was how people feel right before they faint. That strange mix of clarity and distance, like watching your life through a slightly fogged window, and I could feel my heart thumping, steady but loud, each beat reminding me that I was still here, still breathing, still standing in a room that suddenly felt less like family and more like an audience. And maybe the hardest part wasn't what he said, but how normal he made it sound, as if exclusion was reasonable. As if I'd done something so obvious it didn't need explaining, and that's when I noticed my hands, how calm they were, resting at my sides, not shaking, not clenched, and that surprised me because inside there was a storm of questions crashing into each other. When did this decision get made? Who helped you decide this? How long have you been looking at me like this? And yet none of those questions made it to my mouth, because something else was happening there, something quieter, something steadier, and I realized I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing me unravel in front of everyone, not because I was proud, but because I was tired. Tired of proving my worth to people who had already decided what it was. Also, I did the one thing no one expected, the one thing that made the room shift in a way I could almost feel on my skin. I nodded. Just a small movement, nothing dramatic, no words, no protest, just a nod, and the effect of it was immediate and strange, like dropping a stone into still water and watching the ripples spread. Because my nod didn't fit the story they were ready for, it didn't give them closure or conflict. It left them hanging, and I could sense the confusion ripple through the room, through my son especially, his eyebrows tightening just a fraction, as if he'd missed a line in a script he thought he'd memorized. And in that moment I felt something shift, not outside, but inside me, because that nod wasn't agreement, it wasn't surrender, it was acknowledgement. The kind you give when you finally see a situation for what it is and decide you won't waste energy pretending it's something else. And as I turned slightly away, feeling the weight of all those unspoken reactions behind me, I knew they thought this was the end of the story, the quiet humiliation of a woman being put in her place, and I let them think that, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people believe they've won, especially when they have no idea what's already been set in motion. And as I walked away, my heart steady, my face calm, I could almost hear the question forming in my son's mind, the one he didn't ask out loud. Why didn't she fight back? And I smiled to myself, just a little, because the answer to that question would come later, and when it did, It would change everything he thought he knew about control, about silence, and about me. And if you've ever nodded your head while your mind was already 3 steps ahead, then you understand why that quiet moment mattered more than any argument ever could. Because that nod wasn't the end, it was the moment the balance began to tip. People often think that if you don't argue, it means you agree, and if you don't raise your voice, it means you've accepted defeat. Ha ha ha, sigh. But that day, standing there with my son's words still echoing in the air, I knew something they didn't. Something I hadn't even fully put into words for myself yet, and that was that arguing would have changed nothing. Not his mind, not the room, not the story he'd already decided to tell himself about me. Because when someone speaks to you like that, especially in front of others, they're not looking for dialogue. They're looking for confirmation that they were right to push you down, and I wasn't going to give him that. You see. There's a kind of tiredness that settles into you after years of explaining yourself, a deep, bone-level exhaustion that comes from constantly justifying your place in the lives of people who used to need you without question. And I had reached that place long before that day, long before the gathering, long before he opened his mouth, because every ignored call, every rushed visit, every decision made without me had been quietly teaching me the same lesson. That my role in his life was no longer something he felt the need to protect. And once you understand that, once it finally sinks in, you stop fighting shadows, you stop arguing with conclusions that were drawn without you in the room. And instead, you start paying attention, really paying attention to what is actually within your control. Sigh. And as I walked away from that moment, my heart still steady, I could feel the weight of unspoken questions pressing against me. Questions from relatives, from my son, from the part of myself that still wanted to ask why. But I didn't answer any of them, not because I didn't care, but because I cared enough about myself to choose silence over self-betrayal. And I know that might sound strange, choosing silence like it's an act of strength, but sometimes strength isn't loud, sometimes it's quiet and deeply personal. Like deciding you will no longer beg for respect that should have been given freely. Ha ha ha. I remember stepping into the next room, away from the cluster of watching eyes, and for a moment my legs felt weak. Not the kind of weakness that makes you fall, but the kind that reminds you you're human, that you can be hurt and still stand. And I leaned against the wall, closed my eyes, and let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. A long, slow sigh that carried years with it, and in that quiet, something unexpected happened. Instead of anger bubbling up, there was clarity, sharp and calm, like a thought finally finishing itself. And I realized that this wasn't the first time my son had tried to draw a line and dare me to cross it. It was just the first time he'd done it so publicly, and maybe that's why it felt so final, so deliberate. Because public moments are meant to cement private beliefs, and his belief was clear. He thought he had the upper hand. He thought I was cornered by age, by family pressure, by the unspoken rule that mothers must always forgive and endure. And yes, I am a mother, and yes, forgiveness lives somewhere inside me, but so does memory, and memory has a way of stacking facts neatly, even when emotions try to scatter them, and my memory was very clear about one thing. Long before that day, I had already started putting my affairs in order, quietly, carefully, without announcements or drama, not because I planned revenge, but because life teaches you, sometimes gently, sometimes harshly, that you should never assume tomorrow will be kinder than today. And as that realization settled, I understood why I hadn't argued, why my voice hadn't risen. Because the conversation he thought he was starting had already ended in my mind months ago, the moment I accepted that protecting myself was not a betrayal of my child, but a responsibility to myself. Sigh, and that's a hard lesson, one that comes with guilt and second-guessing and long nights of staring at the ceiling, wondering if you're being too cold, too distant, too practical, but then you remember the other side. The side where no one stepped in for you, where no one spoke up in that room, where even love was expected to stay silent and small. And you realize that dignity sometimes means doing nothing in the moment so you can do the right thing later. Ha ha ha. And that day, as I straightened up and smoothed my clothes, feeling the eyes on me again as I re-entered the room, I knew they were waiting for me to say something, anything, to smooth it over, to make it easier for everyone else. But I didn't, because it wasn't my job to make their discomfort disappear, it was my job to take care of myself. And that decision, quiet as it was, had already set something irreversible in motion, something my son couldn't see yet, something none of them could see, because they were too focused on the moment to notice the groundwork that had been laid long before. And as I met my son's gaze once more, calm and steady, I could almost sense his confusion growing, not because he felt guilty, but because my silence didn't fit his expectations, and that's when I knew, truly knew, that choosing not to argue had been the most powerful response I could give, because while words fade and excuses blur, actions, especially the ones taken in silence, have a way of echoing long after the room has emptied. And as I turned away again, my mind already moving forward, I felt a strange mix of sadness and resolve, Because loving someone doesn't mean allowing them to erase you, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is step back. Say nothing and let time reveal the truth that arguing never could. To understand why that silence felt so natural to me, you have to go back not to some dramatic turning point, but to the slow, ordinary years that built everything people later tried to claim without remembering the cost. Sigh, because nothing in my life appeared overnight, not the house, not the stability, not even the sense of family everyone assumed would always be there. It was all layered, brick by brick, choice by choice. Often made when no one was watching or thanking or even noticing, and I remember those early years so clearly, the kind of clear that only comes with time, when memories lose their sharp edges and leave behind the truth, how young we were. How unsure, how every decision felt heavier because there was no safety net underneath us, just hope and stubbornness holding things together. I worked when I was tired, I saved when it hurt to save, I stayed when leaving would have been easier. Not because I was strong in some heroic way, but because someone had to be, and that someone was me, and the house everyone gathered in, the one they whispered in later, didn't come from luck or generosity. It came from years of quiet sacrifice, skipped comforts, delayed dreams, and paperwork people never bother to read until it suddenly matters. And my son grew up inside that effort without ever seeing its full shape. How could he? Children see results, not process, warmth, not wiring, and I don't blame him for that, I really don't, but I do blame him for forgetting, because forgetting is a choice you make when remembering becomes inconvenient. And as the years passed, I noticed how ownership started to shift in people's minds, how familiarity slowly turned into entitlement, how phrases like "our house" slipped out of mouths that had never signed a single document or stayed up at night worrying about interest rates and overdue bills. Sigh, and at first I corrected them gently, laughing it off, saying things like, "well, technically," but then I stopped because I realized something important, that correcting people doesn't always change what they believe, it just teaches them to wait until you're not around to say it again. And so I watched quietly as assumptions piled up, as my role slowly faded from builder to background, from decision-maker to decoration, and that hurt more than I ever admitted out loud. Because it's one thing to be taken for granted, it's another to be quietly erased while still being expected to show up smiling. And somewhere along the way, I started paying closer attention, not in a suspicious way, just in a practical one, noticing who spoke for me, who spoke over me, who made plans that involved my space, my time, my future without ever asking. And I'd sit there, nodding, listening, storing these moments away like receipts you hope you'll never need but keep just in case, and the truth is, long before that day, long before the funeral words were ever spoken, I had already felt the shift. Already sensed that the ground under my feet was being quietly claimed by others, and that's when I made a decision that felt both heavy and relieving, to protect what was mine without announcing it, without drama, without accusations. Because I knew how easily concern could be twisted into control, how quickly boundaries could be labeled as bitterness, and I didn't want to fight that battle, I just wanted clarity, and clarity often lives in documents. Not conversations, so I started sorting things out slowly, carefully, reading every line, asking questions no one knew I was asking, making choices that felt boring on the surface but powerful underneath. And each signature felt less like an act of defiance and more like an act of self-respect, a quiet reminder to myself that I hadn't imagined my contribution, that it existed in ink and dates and legal language that didn't care about tone or family politics. And as I did this, something else happened too. My fear started to loosen its grip. Because there's a strange comfort in knowing where you stand, even if where you stand is alone, and I stopped needing reassurance from people who had already decided they didn't need mine, and that shift changed how I carried myself, how I listened, how I stayed quiet when before I might have explained, and maybe that's why, on the day my son spoke those words, I didn't feel blindsided, hurt, yes, deeply, but surprised, no, because his confidence came from assumptions. And assumptions are fragile things, they crumble the moment they meet facts, and as I think back now, I realize how invisible that preparation was to everyone else, how they mistook my calm for weakness, my silence for surrender, when in reality it was simply the result of knowing exactly what I had already secured, and that knowledge sat inside me that day like a steady heartbeat, quiet but undeniable, reminding me that no matter how loudly someone tries to rewrite history, the truth has a way of staying put, waiting patiently for the moment it needs to speak for itself, and that moment, though no one else knew it yet, was already closer than they thought. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house finally settled back into its old, familiar sounds, I sat alone in the living room and let the quiet wrap around me, not the awkward silence from earlier, but the honest kind. The kind that doesn't watch you or judge you, sigh, just the soft tick of the clock, the distant hum of traffic, the gentle creak of a place that had carried my life for so long, and I won't pretend I was brave in that moment. I was tired, deeply tired, the kind of tired that sinks into your bones and makes even breathing feel like effort, and I remember sinking into the couch, the same one my son used to jump on when he was small. And that memory hit me so suddenly I had to laugh and cry at the same time. Ha ha ha. Oh, because how do you hold love and hurt in the same breath without breaking? And for the first time that day, I let myself feel everything I'd held back, the sting of those words, the way they echoed differently now that no one else was around to hear them, and tears came, slow and quiet, not the dramatic kind. Just a few that slipped down and soaked into the fabric, and I didn't wipe them away right away, because sometimes you need to let your body finish what your heart started, sigh. And as I sat there, memories came in waves. Not just the painful ones, but the ordinary, tender ones too, small hands wrapped around my finger, late-night talks at the kitchen table, his laughter filling rooms that felt too big without it now, and I whispered his name once, softly. Like maybe the walls could carry it back in time, and that hurt more than anything else. Because no matter how strong you become, there's always a part of you that remains a parent first, hoping, waiting, wondering if this distance is permanent or just another phase you'll both survive. And for a moment, doubt crept in, quiet but sharp, asking if I'd done something wrong, if I'd missed a chance to fix things, if my silence earlier had been a mistake. And I sat with that doubt, didn't push it away, didn't argue with it, just let it sit beside me like an unwanted guest, because avoiding it wouldn't make it disappear, ha ha ha, and in that stillness, something surprising happened. The doubt slowly gave way to clarity, the same calm clarity I'd felt earlier, and I realized that even if I had argued, even if I had cried in front of everyone, it wouldn't have changed the truth of where we stood. Because respect doesn't grow out of scenes, it grows out of recognition, and he hadn't recognized me in a long time. Sigh, I stood up then, walked through the house, touching familiar things, the edge of the table. The doorframe with pencil marks still faintly visible, reminders of years measured in growth and care, and with each step I felt a strange mix of grief and grounding, like saying goodbye and hello at the same time. And when I reached the bedroom, I opened the drawer where I kept important papers, not nervously, not urgently, just calmly, and seeing them there, neatly organized, exactly where I'd left them, gave me a quiet sense of peace. Oh, not triumph, not satisfaction, just peace, because it confirmed what I already knew, that I wasn't helpless in this story, that whatever happened next wouldn't erase the work I'd done to protect myself, and I sat on the edge of the bed, holding one of those folders for a moment, feeling its weight, thinking about how funny life is, how something so unremarkable can hold so much meaning, and I let out a small laugh, a soft, almost surprised ha-ha-ha. Because part of me couldn't believe how far things had come, how different everything looked from where I was sitting now compared to years ago, and as the night deepened, my emotions began to settle, not disappear, but soften. Like waves calming after a storm, and I made myself a cup of tea, sat by the window again, the same spot from that morning, and watched the darkness outside, feeling oddly steady, and that's when I made peace with something important. That tomorrow might not bring reconciliation or apologies or understanding, but it would bring consequences, natural ones, quiet ones, the kind that don't need announcements, sigh, and as I finally lay down, exhaustion pulling me under, I thought about my son, not with anger but with a sad kind of acceptance, realizing that whatever lesson he was about to learn, it wouldn't come from my words, it would come from reality itself. And as sleep crept in, heavy and unavoidable, one last thought settled into my mind, calm and certain. By the time the morning came, things would no longer be the way he thought they were, and that knowledge, more than anything else, allowed me to finally rest. Morning came quietly, almost politely, like it didn't want to disturb the weight of what was already in motion, and I woke up before the alarm, staring at the ceiling with that strange feeling you get when you know today isn't ordinary. Sigh, my body felt heavy but my mind was clear, clearer than it had been in a long time, and as I moved through my routine, making tea, straightening cushions, opening the curtains just enough to let light in, I realized how calm everything felt on the outside compared to the storm people probably imagined inside me. Ha ha ha, because this wasn't the kind of day fueled by anger or revenge, it was fueled by certainty. The kind that settles deep and doesn't shake easily, and as I sat at the table, hands wrapped around a warm cup, I thought about how many people live their lives believing stories that were never checked, assumptions passed down like facts, and how rarely anyone stops to ask who actually holds the truth. And if you're listening to this right now and something in it feels uncomfortably familiar, if you've ever felt pushed aside, spoken over, or quietly erased by someone you once gave everything to, then stay with me, because stories like this aren't just entertainment, they're reminders, and if you want to hear more stories that sound a little too real, a little too close to home, take a moment and subscribe, not because of drama, but because you're not alone in these feelings. Now back to that morning, because just as I finished my tea, my phone buzzed. A short vibration that felt louder than it should have in the stillness, and I didn't rush to pick it up. I let it sit there for a moment, because rushing had never helped me before, and when I finally looked, I saw his name, my son's name. And my heart did that familiar tightening thing again, not panic, not fear, just recognition, like here it is. The moment everything starts to shift, and I answered calmly, my voice steady, even surprising myself a little. Ha ha ha, and on the other end there was hesitation, confusion wrapped in authority that suddenly sounded thinner than it had the day before. And as he spoke, I listened, really listened, not just to the words, but to the cracks between them, the pauses. The questions he didn't know how to ask yet, and with every second it became clearer that something had reached him already, some piece of information, some realization that didn't match the version of reality he'd been so confident in. And I said very little, only what was necessary, because sometimes silence does more work than explanations ever could, and when the call ended, I sat there for a long moment, phone resting on the table, heart beating slow and even. And I knew then that the quiet preparation I'd done, the decisions made long before anyone noticed, were finally stepping into the light, not loudly, not dramatically, but firmly, like doors closing behind you one by one. And as I looked around the room, the same room that had witnessed love, tension, laughter, and now this turning point, I felt a mix of sadness and resolve wash over me, all because no matter how necessary something is, it still carries a cost. And the cost here was the final loss of illusion, the illusion that respect would return on its own. That time alone would fix what silence had allowed to grow, and yet beneath that sadness there was relief, real relief. The kind that comes when you stop holding your breath and finally allow yourself to stand where you belong. And I knew, without needing to check a clock or wait for confirmation, that by the time the day was done, the balance of power everyone assumed was fixed would look very different, and the most surprising part wasn't that things were changing, it was how peacefully I was able to watch it happen, knowing that sometimes the strongest turning points arrive not with noise, but with a quiet phone call on an ordinary morning. It didn't take long after that call for the truth to fully reach him, because truth has a way of traveling faster once it's no longer being ignored, and I could almost feel the shift in the air even before the second call came. Ha ha ha, sigh, that subtle change when confidence starts to wobble and certainty gives way to confusion, and when my phone rang again, I knew this one would be different, not because of the name on the screen, but because of the timing. Too soon for comfort, too late for denial, and when I answered, the voice on the other end wasn't the same one that had spoken so clearly the day before. It was tighter now, rushed, edged with something I hadn't heard in a long time, uncertainty. And as he spoke, pieces fell into place without him needing to say them directly, questions about documents, about timing, about things he'd never bothered to understand until they suddenly mattered, and I listened, still calm. Still steady because there was nothing left to explain, the explanations were already written down, filed, signed, sealed, and I could hear it in his pauses. That growing realization that the story he'd been telling himself didn't line up with reality anymore, and for a brief moment, I wondered if this was where anger would finally surface in me. If this was the part where I'd feel satisfied or vindicated, but instead what I felt was sadness, a deep, heavy sadness for the boy who had confused distance with power and silence with weakness. Sigh, and as he spoke faster. As his words started overlapping, I could imagine his face, the furrowed brow, the tightened jaw, the way his world was rearranging itself in real time, and I didn't interrupt him, not once. Because this was his turn to feel what I'd felt for years, that dizzy moment when the ground shifts and you realize you've been standing on assumptions instead of facts. Ha ha ha, and somewhere in the background of the call, I could hear other voices. Relatives, advisors, people suddenly involved now that consequences had arrived. The same people who had stayed quiet when I'd been dismissed, and that didn't make me angry either, it just confirmed something I already knew. That support often appears only when there's something at stake for the supporter. And when he finally stopped talking, waiting for me to respond, there was a long pause, the kind that stretches and presses on you, and I chose my words carefully. Not to wound, not to defend, but to state the truth plainly, without emotion, without accusation, and the effect was immediate. His breathing changed, slower, heavier. Like someone realizing they've misread a map and gone too far in the wrong direction. And for the first time since all of this began, he asked a question instead of making a statement, and that alone told me everything. Because questions mean doubt, and doubt means control has already started to slip. Sigh, and as the call ended, I set the phone down gently, hands not shaking, heart steady, and I sat there in the quiet, aware that somewhere else, in a different room, my son was facing the reality he'd helped create, surrounded by people who suddenly had opinions, advice, and concern, and I wondered if he remembered the way no one spoke when he spoke to me. If he felt that same silence now, closing in around him, ha ha ha, and I won't lie, there was a small, fleeting moment of something like relief, not joy, not pride. Just relief that I no longer had to carry the weight of being underestimated, And as the day moved on, messages came in, some cautious, some awkward, some pretending nothing had changed, and I answered them all the same way, politely. Briefly, without explanation, because the truth didn't need my help anymore, it was doing just fine on its own, and as I looked out the window, watching the world continue as if nothing monumental had happened, I felt a strange sense of balance return, not the old balance where I gave and gave, but a new one, quieter, firmer, built on boundaries instead of expectations. Awe, and I knew then that whatever came next, whatever conversation or confrontation might still be waiting, it would happen on different terms, because the moment my son realized he wasn't standing where he thought he was, everything shifted, not with a shout or a scene, but with the slow, undeniable weight of reality settling in, and that kind of realization, once it takes hold, doesn't let go easily. What surprised me most after that wasn't his reaction, or the sudden change in how people spoke to me. It was how quiet everything became inside me. Ha ha ha, sigh, like a room finally emptied of noise after years of echoing voices. Because once the truth settled, there was no rush of victory, no urge to celebrate or prove a point, just a calm understanding that things had shifted into their proper place, and I noticed it in small ways first. The way messages softened, the way questions replaced commands, the way my name was spoken with care again, as if everyone had suddenly remembered it carried weight, and I watched it all from a distance, not out of bitterness but out of clarity. Because power that has to announce itself is usually the most fragile, and real power doesn't need applause, it just exists, and as the day unfolded, I thought about how easily people confuse kindness for weakness, how quickly patience is mistaken for permission, and I could almost laugh at the simplicity of it all, ha ha ha, because the same silence they'd dismissed had been quietly holding everything together, and now that silence had done its work. And I didn't need to add anything to it, no sharp words, no reminders, no list of sacrifices read aloud for sympathy, because the facts were already enough, and I could feel the shift in how my son approached me too. Not directly at first, more like someone circling a situation they no longer fully understand, cautious, unsure, and that didn't bring me satisfaction, it brought me a kind of sad clarity. Because watching someone you love realize their mistake isn't as satisfying as people think, it's heavy, it carries grief with it. Sigh, and there was a moment, later that evening, when he stood across the room from me, not speaking, just looking. And I recognized that look. It was the same one he had as a child when he realized he'd gone too far and didn't know how to step back, and my chest tightened at that, all because no matter how much things change, that history doesn't disappear, it lingers in expressions and habits and unspoken expectations. And for a second I considered stepping in, smoothing it over, offering comfort, because that's what I'd always done. That's the role I'd played so well for so long, but I didn't, not because I was cold, but because I knew that rescuing him from this moment would only delay the lesson, and lessons delayed have a way of coming back harsher later. Ha ha ha, and so I stayed where I was, calm, open, but firm, letting the space between us exist without rushing to fill it, and in that space I felt something solidify inside me, a boundary that didn't need words, one that simply said, I will not be diminished to make you comfortable anymore, and that realization was strangely freeing, not just for me, but for the relationship itself, because it removed the false balance we'd been living under. The one where I bent and adjusted and apologized for existing, sigh, and as the hours passed, I became aware of how differently I was breathing, deeper, slower, as if my body finally understood it didn't need to stay braced for impact. And I thought about how many years I'd spent anticipating reactions, managing emotions that weren't mine to manage, and how exhausting that had been, and in contrast, how light I felt now, even with the sadness still present. All because sadness and strength can coexist, they don't cancel each other out, and when the day finally drew to a close, I found myself smiling, not a big smile, just a small one, almost surprised. Ha ha ha, because I realized that I hadn't raised my voice, hadn't argued, hadn't explained myself, and yet everything had changed, and that, more than anything, taught me that dignity doesn't need defense, it just needs space to stand. And I knew then that whatever came next, whether reconciliation or distance or something in between, it would be built on a new foundation, one where silence was no longer mistaken for surrender, and where respect, once lost, had finally learned its way back. It still felt strange, how calm I was after everything had shifted, like the storm everyone expected never came, ha ha ha, sigh, because once the truth settled into place, there was nothing left to fight, no point to prove, no victory to parade around, just a quiet understanding that things were finally standing where they always should have been, and I noticed it in the smallest details. The way voices lowered when my name came up, the way people paused before speaking instead of assuming I would simply agree, the way my presence in the room suddenly carried weight again, not because I demanded it, but because it could no longer be ignored, and that calm wasn't empty, it was full of relief, the kind you feel when you've been carrying a heavy bag for years and finally set it down. And as the hours passed, I became more aware of how differently my son moved around me now, careful, measured, like someone learning new ground rules they hadn't realized existed before, and there was no satisfaction in that for me. No secret smile or sense of triumph, only a deep, aching sadness that it had taken this much for him to see me clearly, sigh, because no parent wants to teach their child a lesson through consequences this heavy. But sometimes life insists on being the teacher when we step aside, and I thought about all the times I'd smoothed things over in the past, all the moments I'd made myself smaller so he wouldn't feel uncomfortable, and how that had slowly taught him the wrong lesson, that my silence meant consent, that my patience meant permission, and standing there now, watching the space between us shift. I realized how important it was that I didn't rush to fill it, didn't rush to reassure him or ease the tension, because that space was doing necessary work, it was holding the truth steady so it couldn't be brushed aside again. And there was a moment later, a quiet one, when we found ourselves in the same room without speaking, and I felt the weight of all the years between us, the good and the painful tangled together. Awe, and I could see in his eyes that something fundamental had changed, not just his understanding of the situation, but his understanding of me, and that recognition, fragile as it was, mattered more than any apology could have in that moment, and I stayed calm, open but firm, not as an act, not as a performance, but as a boundary finally honored, sigh, and as evening settled in, I noticed my own breathing again. Slow and steady, a sign that my body no longer felt the need to brace itself, and that was when it truly hit me, how much energy I'd spent for years anticipating reactions, preparing explanations, managing emotions that weren't mine to manage, and how freeing it felt to stop, to simply exist without apology, and I sat with that feeling, letting it sink in. Because I knew it was something I'd fought for quietly and earned the hard way, and when the day finally came to an end, I found myself smiling again, small and almost surprised, not because I'd won, but because I'd finally stood still long enough for the truth to catch up, and in that stillness I understood something deeply, that power doesn't always arrive with noise or force, sometimes it arrives through restraint, through patience, through the courage to let silence do its work, and whatever came next, whether healing or distance or something in between, would grow from this moment, a moment where respect didn't need to be demanded anymore, because it had finally learned how to return on its own. There was one conversation left, I could feel it, lingering in the air like a door that hadn't fully closed yet, sigh, not the kind of conversation people imagine, with raised voices or dramatic confessions, but a quiet one. The kind that happens when all the noise has already done its damage and there's nothing left to hide behind, and it happened later than I expected, when the house was calm again and the day had worn itself out. And my son finally stood in front of me without the armor he'd been wearing before, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, because sometimes words take time to arrive when the truth has already spoken first. And I looked at him then. Really looked not at the man who had dismissed me, but at the child I had raised, the one whose laugh I could still hear in the corners of this house, and my heart ached in that familiar, complicated way that only parents understand. The ache that carries love and disappointment together without knowing how to separate them, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, uncertain, stripped of the confidence that had once sounded so sharp. And he didn't apologize the way movies teach people to apologize. There were no perfect words, no dramatic admissions, just fragments, pauses, an attempt to explain that sounded more like confusion than defense. And I let him talk, I let him struggle through it, because this time it was his turn to sit in discomfort, sigh, and as he spoke I realized something important. He wasn't asking for forgiveness yet, not really, he was asking for relief. For the tension to be lifted so things could go back to how they were, and I knew then that this was the moment that mattered most, not the one where I proved my strength, but the one where I chose what kind of strength I wanted to carry forward. And I answered him gently, not with anger, not with blame, but with honesty, the kind that doesn't raise its voice but doesn't soften the truth either. I told him that love doesn't disappear when respect is lost, but it does change shape, and that things couldn't simply return to how they were because how they were had allowed this to happen in the first place. And I could see the weight of that land on him, not all at once but slowly. Like someone realizing a door they assumed was unlocked now required effort to open, and there was silence after that, long and heavy but not hostile, and in that silence I felt something loosen inside me. A knot I hadn't realized I was still carrying, because speaking my truth without shouting, without defending, without shrinking felt like a release, and for the first time I wasn't trying to fix him or the situation. I was simply standing in my own space, sigh, and he nodded then, a small nod, not agreement, not resolution, just acknowledgement, and that was enough for me in that moment, because acknowledgement is where change begins. And as he stepped back, giving me room instead of taking it, I understood that forgiveness, if it was going to come, would come slowly, not as an eraser of the past, but as a careful rebuilding of trust, and I was at peace with that. All because peace doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it means clarity, and as he walked away, leaving the room quieter than before, I felt a strange mix of sadness and calm settle over me. Knowing that whatever our relationship would become from here, it would be built on honesty instead of assumption, and that, for the first time in a long while, felt like a foundation strong enough to stand on. When everything finally settled, when there were no more calls coming in and no more conversations waiting around corners, I found myself alone again, not in a painful way, but in a reflective one. Ha ha ha, sighed, the kind of quiet where you sit with your thoughts and realize how much has changed without the world ever making a sound about it, and I stood by the window one last time, watching the evening light soften the edges of the day, thinking about how strange it is that life's biggest lessons rarely arrive with announcements. They just show up, sit down beside you, and wait for you to notice them. And I thought about my son, about the love that still existed even after everything that had happened, because love doesn't vanish just because respect stumbles, it adjusts, it learns new boundaries, it finds new shapes. And that realization didn't make me sad anymore, it made me calm because it meant I didn't have to choose between loving him and loving myself. Sigh, I could do both, quietly, firmly, without apology. And as I breathed in that understanding, I felt something else too, gratitude, not for the pain, but for the clarity it brought, because clarity is a gift, even when it arrives wrapped in heartbreak. Ha ha ha, and if there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that silence is not weakness, patience is not permission, and dignity doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard, it just needs time and truth to stand beside it. And I know there are people listening right now who recognize themselves in this story, who have nodded instead of arguing, who have swallowed words to keep the peace, who have been underestimated simply because they chose restraint over reaction. And if that's you, I want you to know something. Your quiet does not erase your worth, and your preparation, even when no one sees it, matters more than you think. And before we part, if stories like this speak to you, if they make you pause and breathe a little deeper, consider subscribing to the channel, not for drama, but for connection, for the reminder that you're not alone in these moments. Sigh, and as I turn away from the window, feeling the house settle around me once more, I know that whatever the future holds, I will walk into it with steadiness, with self-respect. And with the understanding that sometimes the most powerful endings aren't loud or triumphant, they're quiet, resolved, and full of hard-earned peace, and that to me is more than enough.